Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
And I'm Courtney, and we are missing Rye this week, which is very sad, but it does mean that Nick and I can talk about Marvel and Star Wars as much as we want.
Yes, indeed we can. Those are not Rye's favorite topics, so we do miss Rye, but maybe we can use this week, Court, to make a bunch of pop culture references that we normally wouldn't make. We'll see what happens. Anyway, the inspiration for our episode today is one of the most common questions that comes up, or that people just ask me directly. Like, Nick, what does SEL have to do with PBIS? Or, Nick, is SEL just the new PBIS? And, Court, I'm going to do something that we never do on the podcast, and I'm just going to answer that question right away at the beginning of the episode without any nuance or context whatsoever.
Goodness, what?
I know, right? Like, maybe it's just the warm weather affecting my impulse control. I don't know, but yeah, if I have 5 seconds during a meeting to explain this to someone, and I have done that many times this year, I basically say, so PBIS is really good at clearly and consistently telling our kids where the bar is for their behavior. SEL is how we give them all those skills that they need to meet that bar. So that is an oversimplification, but I think it does get at the central kind of core of that relationship between those two things. So we wanted to share that right away because it typically resonates with people. PBIS is communicating where that bar is, and SEL is a lot of other stuff that we do to help kids meet that bar. Like I said, though, that's an oversimplification. PBIS is a lot of things, but PBIS is really grounded in the student code of conduct, in our rules, expectations, boundaries, whatever kind of verbiage we're using for that. It's grounded in that line between expected and unexpected behavior. And like I mentioned earlier, like SEL is that bigger picture, and it's grounded in competency, in skills, in learning. So there's just like a subtle difference between those two things. So for example, I would be asking myself with SEL, like, where should a middle schooler be with their goal setting skills, their organizational skills, their conflict resolution skills? Like, what are all the things that we can be doing to support their learning of those skills? That's why that big picture of SEL is really grounded in SEL standards. Like I said, competency, skills versus the student code of conduct. And this is not an either or. These aren't competing. That's a really important thing to emphasize. They work really, really well together. And I've had the true pleasure of working in a school where the bar setting, communication, PBIS, and the skill building were both happening and seamlessly working well together. So they're not at all competing. So anyway, that is a quick, oversimplified summary of how PBIS and SEL relate to each other.
Yeah, but after we share what's filling our buckets, we're obviously going to dig into this more. But on the surface, that SEL versus PBIS question is pretty nerdy and ticky-tacky. And I think a lot of educators might want to tune out when they start hearing acronym debates. And quick aside, there's a good reason for that. What we really care about are those outcomes. Happy, successful students and happy adults. And it can absolutely feel like acronyms are this kind of exhausting distraction from the real work that we need to do to get those happy outcomes. But even if you feel that way and maybe you're not really interested in how SEL and PBIS relate to each other, I think you might find this episode interesting. Because we're calling that initiative fatigue out because we know it's a problem. And part of what we want to do with this episode is to share the story of how we came to understand that problem and how we're hopefully on the path to making it better with the work we've been doing over the past year or so.
Yes, but before that, let's talk about what's filling our buckets this week. I'll go first. And 2, Courtney, if I could have 2.
You can have 5.
Okay. Well, first, a few educators in a few of our districts the other day brought up, like, by themselves that the podcast had been helpful to them this year and that they appreciated it. And it just makes me so happy when I hear that because, Court, we so badly wanted to, really accomplish something useful this year during a really weird school year and actually help people in an efficient way using our technology to do a podcast. So just hearing like that people valued that really makes my day. And second, playing fetch with my dog in the backyard when it gets warm out just fills my bucket to the brim.
I love
so that's
that.
making me very happy.
Outside with puppies is just top notch.
Oh, yes.
And mine is one, I think it was even last week maybe that we talked about this already, but this
Mm-hmm.
morning the person in front of me paid for my caribou. And it's just was such a surprise. I think our local caribou must just be amazing. It's the one in Cambridge, because it happens to rise so often. And like, this isn't the first time it's happened to me there, but it's just awesome. So I paid it forward and got the person behind me, and my day's just been awesome.
That's never ever happened to me or anybody I know besides you and Rye, so it must be something about Cambridge.
It's so fun.
It's great. Well, let's shift to our main topic. So from here on out in the episode, there's really two parts, and that's because I couldn't figure out in our outline a really great way to blend those two things together. So there's really just two parts. And as always, please use the time codes in the episode description if you'd like to skip part of the episode. But first, part one, we're going to share kind of like a personal story about what I've learned in my career from experiencing initiative fatigue with behavior stuff. Second part, we're going to get a little bit more technical and try and more deeply answer that question and talk about how PBIS and SEL overlap and don't overlap piece by piece. So, okay, part one, story time. So when I finished my internship in Delaware and moved back to Minnesota, started working in North Branch, I was, as they say, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. So when I would hear acronyms and things like MTSS, PBIS, SEL, restorative practices, trauma-informed practices, student-centered discipline, it all felt terrifically important and urgent. And I wanted so badly to work in a school that did all of those things absolutely perfectly. And I just saw no downsides to pursuing all of that stuff, voraciously and quickly and just getting it all done. And that did not happen. We did not get it all done. We did some very good things that I'm still very proud of, but we did not, quote unquote, get her all done. And I learned it wasn't because, nobody cared about the same things that I cared about. The people I was working with cared so much about their students. And in fact, I think, it was that care that made it harder than sometimes to get traction when you're throwing out all these acronyms at people, because it's just too much. It's noise. It becomes really overwhelming, Court. Mm-hmm. So eventually, skipping some things, I found myself on a mental health committee that was pulled together from people from our 6 districts. And I was still pretty bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And we basically came together and said, hey, there's 4 big things like PBIS, SEL, restorative practices, being trauma-informed. We want those 4 things to be happening in our schools. And if you want to make any of those things happen, what you do basically, Court, is you take a rubric, like a PBIS rubric, and you use that rubric to figure out what parts of PBIS you're doing and what parts you're not doing. And that helps you figure out what to do next to get better, because you can't do it all at once. You can't attack it all at once. So we took 4 rubrics for those 4 things, 1 for PBIS, 1 for SEL, 1 for restorative practices, and 1 for trauma-informed practices, 4 rubrics from, fancy national organizations, and we smashed them together like the Large Hadron Collider. And we made one massive rubric.
I love
and
a
I
rubric.
I was so proud of our massive 4-part rubric. So at the time, we did realize that there was a good deal of overlap between those 4 things, and we did try to blend things together to make a more efficient, giant 4-part rubric. So anyway, I was super, super psyched about this. It's going to change the world. Then I went to a few conferences. I don't remember exactly when, and I won't call anybody out about what I was going to, but I remember one day at a conference, I got just barraged by session after session of bouncing between those 4 topics. So I would have the takeaways would be in order to do PBIS really well, you should really be doing a lot with your SEL. Oh yeah, trauma-informed practices is basically doing SEL, PBIS, and also, restorative practices are also important. And it just dawned on me throughout that day that our 4-part rubric was not the way, quote unquote. This is not the way. And that continued to slowly dawn on me because we don't learn lessons just one day, one time. So later that spring, I think I found myself presenting to a big room full of teachers talking so excitedly about restorative practices and the whole model of restorative practices and all the jargon of restorative practices. And I'm so regretful about that in hindsight, because if I were in that situation again, I would have stripped a lot of that jargon away and done so much more to try and build a bridge between the small parts of this that were really new to those teachers and the many, many parts of it that overlapped and really deeply connected to the things that they already did, the things that they were comfortable with, the things that they cared about.
Yeah, I think it's just super important to meet people where they're at. All that jargon just gets overwhelming, like you said, and so many people are already doing great things that are connected to all of those things that you've already been talking about.
Yeah, and one thing I like to say now is that I'm probably going to get myself in trouble just by saying this, but like it makes sense. Like I'd rather just implement restorative practices at this point without even uttering that full phrase, like restorative practices. And I really learned this lesson also from working for 3 years in a small, tiny behavior-focused setting 4 program with brilliant educators and teachers in Paris who I learned so much from. It's kind of when you work in a place like that that's so focused on behavior and it's so small, so it's easier to make adjustments to it. It's kind of like a little think tank, test tank where you really learn a lot. But anyway, we were implementing PBIS and SEL and restorative practices and trauma-informed practices, all 4 of those things. You know, not perfectly. I say all the time on the podcast, like, we're not perfect. There were a lot of holes, but one thing I'm proud of that I thought was so valuable, and it's part of the lesson that I learned, is how we blended those things together. So we almost never used those 4 big labels. It was really all about the little pieces underneath them, like how we reinforce students, how we praise students, how we respond when we're correcting. Like all those things that we know are like the bread and butter of teaching day to day. Like that's what we were able to like talk about and focus on. And it really wasn't as much about those big labels. And it didn't feel as much like we were riding on that merry-go-round between different initiatives. So anyway, like the conclusion of the story is that last spring, I applied for a job called SEL Services Coordinator. And I was like, yes, this will be the one acronym to end all acronyms. It's the biggest tent. It includes all the other stuff. We've really got to cut through that noise of different labels and initiatives. We've got to cut through that noise. We've got to make this one thing instead of 4 or 5 things. Teachers and principals and counselors and social workers, they don't have time to look at those separate pieces of the puzzle totally separately. And that's where my personal little professional motto comes from. That's in the episode title, Less New, More Better. I think I've grown, I like to think, in the last like half a decade from being this excited about everything educator. Everything is, excited about everything new, and just the newness of it was really exciting, to now being, I think, so much more focused on understanding, like you said, Court, what's already there and how we can build on it to actually get better and better. And I just think that's so important. And that's why you might hear me say less new, more better. And that's why we're so passionate, our team, about SEL, because it is that one giant bucket that's big enough to fit everything else into it, to be our one acronym and our one mission that pulls everything together.
Well said.
Thanks, Court. So that was part 1 of the episode, the story. And now we're going to shift into the second part, which is digging deeper into that question of how PBIS and SEL relate to each other. So that question comes up a lot because the vast majority of our schools in our member districts have been implementing PBIS for a few years, or quite a few years now. It's there. It's a big deal. We've got to address it. Just like Ron Burgundy from Anchorman, PBIS is kind of a big deal around here.
Now, Nick, we haven't specifically talked about Anchorman. I don't know if you knew that my just affinity for Anchorman, but I don't know if our listeners know. Nick and I have very similar taste in television, so we have so many inside jokes and so many things that we talk about, so I just love that you included that. Such a big deal.
PBIS, like, I'm kind of a big deal.
Exactly.
I have many leather-bound books. People know me.
It smells of rich mahogany.
So last spring, we received this SEL grant from the state. My position, SEL Services Coordinator, was created. We launched a cross-district SEL website. This fall, we started a podcast called A Slice of SEL. Maybe you've heard of it. So depending on who you are and where you work, it might have felt like, whoa, where the heck is all this SEL buzzword stuff coming from? So one way to answer that question about how SEL and PBIS relate to each other. One way to look at it is like SEL is the bigger fish that's eating the smaller fish, PBIS. And allow me to explain that a little bit. So if you've seen Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, and I wouldn't encourage you to do that if you haven't, because it's not a great film. There's a ridiculous scene where the Jedi Knights and Jar Jar Binks are in this submarine. They're getting chased by this huge carnivorous fish. And at the last second, a much bigger fish comes out of nowhere and eats the smaller fish. And then there's that line that Liam Neeson says, "There's always a bigger fish." So that's not a great analogy. I'll admit that. But the idea is that SEL is really just a bucket of practices. It's a collection of things that a school could do. And when you put all those pieces together and you do most or all of them, the research tells us that you're going to get closer to having happy students and happy adults.
And PBIS is the same thing, really. As you're so fond of saying, Nick, it's really just like a bucket of practices. How we tell kids what the rules are, how we respond when the rules are broken, etc. Just a bunch of pieces, and when we put them together, we get good outcomes. And I think what you're getting at with your fish analogy is that SEL is really just a bigger bucket of practices than PBIS. There's a lot of overlap, but if we're going to pick one bucket to talk about, talk to parents about it, bring it up during staff meetings and all that, SEL has some advantages because it's a big enough bucket to hold all the important practices that we want in our schools. Man, we've said bucket so many times in the last few minutes.
Yeah. But I like what you were saying, Court. There's only so much bandwidth, we like to say, that parents and teachers have, because busy people, and having to understand those different acronyms and how they do or do not overlap with each other, that can be asking a lot. So I think that's why quite a few districts that we've been working with and talking to in Minnesota this year have gravitated to that idea of, hey, SEL is great. We can make that our kind of one big mission and put everything we care about with behavior and mental health under that SEL umbrella. And then we can kind of cut through that noise, like we said earlier. But with that, all that said, let's talk about the big pieces of PBIS and how they do or don't overlap with SEL. PBIS, by the way, is Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. I don't think we've said that full name yet. SEL is Social Emotional Learning. I hope you've learned that if you're a repeat listener to the podcast by now, but I thought, sure. Anyway, a big piece of PBIS is like, hey, school, use some common language when you're telling kids what the rules are. Kids shouldn't have to learn like 6 or 7 different sets of rules for the different classrooms that they're in, and the hallways and the lunchroom and other common settings shouldn't be like a Thunderdome of undefined chaos. There's another pop culture reference. We got to get on the same page. So we're going to carve out a memorable list of 3 to 5 global expectations like safe, respectful, responsible. We're going to figure out what it means to be safe, respectful, and responsible in each part of the building. And we're going to make sure that we really clearly explain those rules to kids proactively. And I mean it, like really do that. Like make some lessons, some slides, some games, do some modeling. Just take the time to make sure kids are really clear on what those expectations are.
Yeah, and we did a whole episode a few months ago about classroom and school rules, and a big takeaway is that the rules we say to kids day to day are kind of this buffer layer of communication, because we can't go around quoting the student code of conduct all day long every day. At the end of the day, this is about what's expected versus unexpected, appropriate or inappropriate. And the student code of conduct is the ultimate resource that tells us where that bar is. But like Nick said, schools that are doing PBIS really well are doing a really good job with common language among the adults. The students are hearing really consistent and clear messages about where the bar is for their behavior from all the adults that they work with during the school day.
And I usually point to this common language and this consistency as the defining feature of PBIS, because it's really the major thing in the PBIS bucket that only lives there. Everything else, for the most part, in that PBIS bucket is also in the SEL bucket. It's also in the MTSS bucket. And when we say bucket, we could also be using the word rubric. Having those common expectations and that common language is PBIS's crown jewel, as I see it. And I do love it, because I mentioned I've worked in a setting for SPED behavior program with very intense student behavior, and the adults had to be very, very much on the same page. So PBIS was really a godsend for us. So I'm personally a huge fan of that piece of PBIS, that ability to have that common language and consistency with my colleagues.
Me too, but even though that consistency is such a unique thing to PBIS, expectations and rules are part of SEL. And now this is an important point. You could do SEL without also doing PBIS. In a building like that, maybe instead of having consistent rules across settings and classrooms, they seek student input and co-develop rules together for each classroom, and then maybe they send delegates from each classroom to write a school-wide constitution. I mean, that's literally how it might look in the responsive classroom model, and those are two extremes, PBIS by itself and that thing I just described. But I would recommend you listen to our episode about it because it's not just black and white distinction. There aren't just two different ways for a school to run their expectations. There are pros and cons to every variation and every approach.
Yeah, our episode about rules kind of went into that. There's just so many decisions you can make between classrooms and common settings and student input and consistency across places. There's a lot of variations you can have. And like you said, pros and cons. But I want to come back to something you said. Having expectations, rules, agreements, whatever we're deciding to call them, that is part of SEL. It's important. It gives kids predictability, which is a word that we love to use. It's so important. It helps kids make responsible decisions. And really the only thing a school can truly do wrong, as I see it in this area, is just to not provide any direction or leadership or training. None of that. Just provide none of that on how they're going to set those expectations or rules. To not be intentional in just some way about talking about our game plan for setting those boundaries, those expectations, those rules. But let's keep going. Another big piece of PBIS is acknowledging and reinforcing it when students meet the expectations, when they meet that bar. So praise is part of that. And then many PBIS schools do use some form of a ticket system, a token economy where students earn incentives. So similar to the rules piece that we just talked about, PBIS by itself is a pretty specific execution of this, having that reinforcement system and those tickets in many cases.
But reinforcing expected behavior is hardly unique to PBIS, and it's something that certainly falls in the SEL bucket. Any teacher who's ever said, "good job," or praised a student for their persistence, or for not giving up, or for helping their friend when they fell down on the playground, they know that it's important to acknowledge it when kids are making good choices and doing things that we'd like to see more of. It's part of SEL for sure.
Right. And moving on, like another piece of PBIS is responding in a consistent, predictable way when students break a rule. So to break that down, like my voice tone, the words I'm using, when I would speak up versus when I would just ignore the behavior, when I refer a student out of my classroom, all of that is going to be pretty consistent from student to student. So there's that predictability and that consistency. PBIS is also more and more emphasizing that we should use those mistakes that students are making when they're breaking a rule as teachable moments, you could say. So we should be helping a student to process what happened, to reflect on or practice what they could have done differently, and also restore things that were damaged. And what I mean by that is like maybe something is literally broken and maybe we need to try and fix it or make it up in some way. Or maybe we just hurt someone's feelings and we need to apologize, try and be restorative. There's enormous overlap between all of what I just described and all the things in the SEL bucket around correcting, responding to student misbehavior, discipline. They're essentially interchangeable because there's just so much overlap between those things.
So let's be funny and pretend we're trying to stump each other. So Nick, I've got one for you. PBIS also includes tiers of interventions, Tier 2 and Tier 3. They get more intense, more supports, more instructional time, more focused instruction. So things like check-in, check-out, check-in, connect, social skills groups, and so on. PBIS is more than those rules and the reinforcement and the consistent correction practices that we use across the whole school. It's also multi-tiered. Now, Nick, that can't also be part of SEL.
Oh my gosh, Court, why yes, it is Court. But really SEL in like rubric terms is very clear that we need to have a continuum, and they use that word, of increasingly intensive interventions. So SEL is a little bit more vague about what that looks like. Like an SEL rubric from the National SEL organization, CASEL. They don't go into detail about what Tier 2 means versus Tier 3, for example, the way that PBIS rubrics tend to. Our schools, in our member districts, have done a lot of work over the last decade plus to try and have that strong continuum of instruction and supports, not just in SEL behavior, but in academics as well. So what we're trying to have with that continuum is a really strong, robust tier 1, that universal instruction that all students get. Then we want targeted tier 2 interventions that some students need, and a variety of them that we can match students with. Then we need intensive, individualized tier 3 interventions that a few students need. And then special education, which is basically, you could say like just tier 3 on steroids. It's basically the same approach, but just there's more oomph to it. Seeing the whole school that way as a continuum with different levels of support and instruction is a big part of what we call MTSS. And I think we've mentioned MTSS a couple times in this episode, but MTSS, a multi-tiered system of supports, plural supports.
So we've covered how that continuum is part of PBIS. That's where we started with this. It's also part of SEL, and it's also part of MTSS. I think this is part of why I've heard you say SEL is behavior MTSS so many times, Nick.
Yeah, I've said that hundreds of times this year. And I'm not contradicting what I said earlier about, SEL being that one acronym to end all acronyms. At least I'm hopefully not contradicting myself too much. But SEL is that unifying initiative that pulls all the other behavior stuff underneath it, under this one big tent of SEL. That's still true. The only thing in my mind that's bigger than that is MTSS, because MTSS is about the whole child, including academics and SEL. So that's why we say SEL is behavior MTSS. It's just that big part of MTSS for behavior, mental health. It's all about that continuum, though, and getting students the support they need when they need it, using our data. That's one of my shorthand, elevator speeches on MTSS. It's a continuum, and where we get students the level of support they need when they need it, using our data. And no, Court, you did not get me. The takeaway here is that PBIS has those tiers, so does SEL. So it's all overlap, Court.
Well, okay, but you did mention data, and I think we should cover that and then move on because we don't want the episode to last forever.
Right. So in PBIS, we're using data to figure out a lot of different things, and I'm just going to name a couple examples. So figuring out what discipline trends we have school-wide. We've got, for example, a spike of discipline incidents around technology use. So we would share that out with the staff, that data, and we would figure out what we can do to tackle that problem. Another example, we could use data to figure out which students are at risk. So we could look at, low attendance, high discipline referrals, failing grades. Maybe we have a screening tool to add to that, like the SABRs you may have heard of. We take all those multiple data points and we would use it to figure out which students need tier 2 supports and what kind of support they need. And when students do receive that supplemental tier 2 support, that extra instruction, we use data to figure out if it's working or not, and that drives all of our decisions from there. So that's a big part of PBIS, that data use. It's also a huge part of MTSS, and also a huge part of SEL. All that overlaps. If you look at CASEL, and just CASEL, though, they're not going to be as detailed about what I just described, as a PBIS rubric or an MTSS rubric is going to be. And before I forget to mention it, Court, that does bring us back to some of the work that we've done with our districts this year. And this also connects to my story about the 4-part rubric from the first part of the episode. We're going full circle. It's all coming together. Anyway, this year we made something called an MTSS implementation tracker, or a MIT. And we, you want an acronym that's easy to use day to day, and we got it, a MIT. One principal said, it's like a baseball mitt. You can, everything's in there. You throw everything into it. It's the mitt.
I love that.
So everything we've talked about in this episode so far, everything, the rules, the reinforcement, the correction, the continuum of supports, the data, it's all in that MIT tool. And of course, we have one single column on that tool for all of our behavior stuff, an SEL column, not 4 separate columns. And that's part of the growth from my story, is that, Court, we got it all down into one mission and one column. But part of the reason we did that is the thing that I've mentioned a couple of times. CASEL, the national organization that really leads SEL across the country, their materials do include all of this stuff that we've talked about. but they're not always as specific and detailed enough as we would want. So we invested a very large amount of time this year into making an integrated tool, that MIT that I've mentioned, that includes academics, it includes SEL, but within SEL, we've enhanced that detail. So for example, we're not talking just vaguely about a continuum of supports, we're being more detailed by addressing that overlap and pulling pieces from MTSS and PBIS. All that overlap is there. We're just making sure we have the right level of detail and precision for it to be really useful to our buildings. And we're so excited about that because it's already helping us have really productive, on the same page, getting on the same page conversations about where each school is and where we want to go together. And we're going to repeat that year after year, and it's going to take us really far together.
That's so exciting. But before we tie this episode up, I think we should say a few words about things in that big SEL bucket that aren't within the smaller bucket of PBIS. We're not going to have time to go into everything right now. It's just too much. But we encourage you to listen to one of our very first podcast episodes where we talked about the how of SEL. We also have a top 10 facts about SEL video on our YouTube channel that walks through all of the pieces. But I think one of the major pieces in that SEL bucket is explicit SEL instruction. So that's like curriculums like second step or our own Be Good People curriculum. And I'm going to circle back to that elevator speech you gave at the very beginning of the episode, Nick. PBIS tells kids where the bar is. SEL helps kids meet that bar. So we want kids to develop SEL skills, soft skills, some call them, to stay organized, set goals, form meaningful relationships, show empathy, resolve conflicts, know their traits and their emotions, respond to their emotions in healthy ways, respect differences, use a growth mindset, and so much more. All of those skills are covered in the SEL standards: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. So there is some overlap between those skills and the rules that we're communicating to students with our PBIS expectations. Like we might teach a lesson in second step about using appropriate voice tone, and that's also one of our rules in our PBIS expectations. But those SEL standards really are a much bigger picture. We need instruction and curriculum to teach a kid how to manage their emotions, just for example. Teaching kids our rules, regardless of how well we do it, doesn't replace that.
Yeah, and a stereotype of SEL is that that's all that SEL is. Curriculum and explicit instruction. Kind of, we've mentioned like a teacher standing in front of a group of kids and teaching them belly breathing is like the stereotype. So some people might have seen the second step curriculum and SEL as synonymous, as the same thing. No, I mean, like we said throughout this episode, SEL is a big whole package. It's a huge bucket of stuff. This is just one piece, this explicit instruction in this curriculum. But it is a piece that our schools know is really important. Before this year, we had schools using curriculums like Second Step. We had some who were pulling together DIY activities or things from Teachers Pay Teachers. And often, not always, but often, that was grounded in a school's PBIS team, quote unquote. Even though, yeah, like this is beyond, like using Second Step or something, that's beyond the traditional scope of just PBIS. And there's plenty of other stuff that we care about, that we know our students need, that we know is worthwhile, that doesn't fall into that more narrow scope of that PBIS bucket. And that, I think, is why we heart SEL so much, because it's just that bigger fish eating the smaller fish.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to our takeaways. And I'll just say it one more time. PBIS is really good at clearly and consistently telling kids where the bar is for their behavior. SEL is how we give them all those skills that they need to meet that bar. SEL, like I said a moment ago, it's like that bigger fish that's eating the smaller fish. It's okay for PBIS to still be there. It's okay to talk about the relationship between the two of them. But when push comes to shove, it is really nice if we're going to, talk about, use our bandwidth to mention and get one thing in people's heads, one mission. SEL can be that one single thing that includes everything that we care about, because it includes all the things that are PBIS, but it includes more things, important things. And why are we even talking about this? Because working in schools is hard. Really, really hard. We can do hard things, but it's hard. And we really have very limited time to have conversations with each other about, like, hey, what are we doing? Like, is it working? Can we do better? And I mean, like, on a really big school-wide level. those continuous improvement conversations that make our schools better places for adults and kids. And during those very limited opportunities to have those conversations, I don't think we should spend those conversations getting all tied up in knots, like stuck in the weeds, trying to implement 4 or 5 different behavior initiatives at the same time. So we really like SEL because it allows us to have one conversation to cut through that noise and get focused on specifically what we want to do next. And we're so excited about what our member districts have accomplished this year, but we're even more excited about where we're heading next year.
It's also very exciting. And thanks for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. And we'll see you when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.